Broadcasting from Salisbury University campus, this is WSDL Ocean City, NPR News Talk 90.7. Putting Delmarva first. Stay tuned for Delmarva Today with your host, Don Rush.
It's been just over 50 years since the racial upheavals of the 1960s hit Cambridge, but we now find ourselves immersed in one of the most racially divisive eras in decades. Welcome to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush. It was in July of 1967 when a large chunk of Cambridge went up in flames. Fires came after a tense summer, which saw H. Reb Brown come to the Eastern Shore, making a fiery speech before the central portion of the black community was ablaze. It's been called the Cambridge Uprising, and the racial inequalities were on full display. In our studio this morning is Dr. Peter Levy. He is professor of history and political science at York University in Toronto. Also, he's author of a number of articles and books on the uprising, including Civil War on Race Street, the Civil Rights Movement. Also with us is Artura Jackson. She is also a Salisbury alum, amongst other things. Also runs a Black History program for some counties here in Maryland, as well as Lawrence McMillan. He is a Philadelphia detective, and we appreciate you all stopping by.
Thanks for having us. Thank you.
So let me start with you, Peter. So give us a sense of what Cambridge looked like at the time in terms of how far it had come in terms of race relations. I understand that segregation was still around even at that late date. Give us a sense of what the atmosphere was like.
So Cambridge kind of is a paradox, really. So it saw itself as a progressive community because it had never disenfranchised blacks. Yet in the early 1960s, the unemployment rate was really deplorable, about between 20 and 30% because the main company, the Phillips Packing Company, had collapsed. And on top of that, all blacks essentially lived in the second ward, segregated to about 30 to 40% of the community. Lived in one of 5 wards. They had a member of the town council, but that was only one of every 5 councilmen. And as of 1967, they had a kind of a vibrant civil rights movement in the early parts of the 60s that had even led to the National Guard being called in for over a year. Things had seemingly calmed down a little bit in the middle of the 1960s when kind of a new black group called the Black Action Federation sought to really galvanize things again and got Gloria Richardson, who had been the leader in the movement, down there to invite Brown into town.
So what was that atmosphere like? Because we're talking about, like, for instance, 1963, I think the National Guard is called in. I think J. Millard Hawes is involved. So it seems as if there's already some premonition that something is going on besides just simply ordinary life.
Well, I think a lot of whites thought when Richardson left, the problems had gone, but I think that was pretty common in a lot of communities to blame problems on outsiders or kind of local malcontents, which was just kidding themselves. I mean, for example, for years, one of the points of contention had been a swimming pool which was owned and controlled by the volunteer fire company. And there had been protests at the swimming pool. In the mid-'60s, there was a suit to try to open it up to blacks. The courts ruled against the fire company, and rather than desegregate the pools, the company decided just to close the pool down. So the situation was tense, but still, I think at the same time, I think a lot of whites in Cambridge, like in a lot of other communities, kind of thought, well, this is something that happened somewhere else, but not in our town anymore.
Artura, give me a sense about how you look at this, particularly in terms of what the period of the time was in which there was obviously a lot of upheaval, and there were all other things going on the shore. I mean, besides that, and there was attempts at integration and so on. What sense do you get about that feeling, particularly in the African American community?
So I'm not a native shoreman. I'm from the Western Shore, and I moved here when I went to college. And what I found interesting was that in my history courses, I didn't learn about Gloria Richardson until I dug into it. I didn't really understand completely the movement. So the sense that I got from the community here is that it was something that happened. It's something that I would, be proud of. It was a dynamic movement to have a woman at the helm of the as a leader in the civil rights movement, breaking down walls and barriers. That's something to be proud of. But I think because there was not a true resolve at the end with A. Brown, that it leaves kind of like an open wound for the community, so that it's hard for them to progress or to acknowledge it or to embrace it. Today, you see groups like the Eastern Shore Network for Change that are doing things like that, but it's taken almost 50 years for us to get to this point.
By the way, tweeters read that there was a meeting, I think it was last year, in which the network had a bunch of people come in, and one of the surprising things about that meeting was how heated the discussions were, that somehow this has all been held in and suddenly it's kind of flushed out. I mean, is that the sense you get about this community?
Yeah, I was amazed. I think the two people who led the gathering just did a remarkable job and had a lot of support even from the Chamber of Commerce and travel people. And I noted one moment that just stood out for me is they put a mural. It's really a beautiful mural as you first come down Route 50, and there's Harriet Tubman, and there's Gloria Richardson, there's the rest of the black community. And it wasn't the only mural. This was the fifth mural of kind of ordinary people in Cambridge. Yet they had to have police guards when the mural was unveiled, because there still was they thought that people were going to try to spark a new riot, and really they were just trying to say, let's remember this history and be proud of Gloria Richardson, be proud of Harriet Tubman. I think it took about 150 years for them to kind of build a national park for Tubman too. So
it's true. Well, describe for me, Richardson. What kind of person was she, and how did she wind up heading up this movement?
Well, it's too bad it's radio, because there's this image of Gloria Richardson in 1963 staring down National Guardsmen, and she's wearing blue jeans. Women didn't wear jeans very often. Two, she's as Tura said, she's a middle-aged woman with two young daughters, who was highly educated and come from a well-off and well-established family. She was raised to be a race woman, but her grandfather was somewhat of a gradualist, and she's not. She's really not going to accommodate anyone. And I think the moment that really symbolizes that, in 1963, a vote took place on whether to really repeal an ordinance that would have desegregated restaurants and the like. And Richardson said, we shouldn't even have to vote on this. These are human rights. You can't leave human rights up to the white majority. And she took a lot of flack from white and black moderates for that, because blacks were struggling in the South to gain the right to vote. But her experience had been that these are natural rights that all people enjoy. And I think that kind of claim still resonates today. A couple years ago, when say same-sex marriage was an issue, the question is, should that be really put up to a vote to the people? Why do whites get to vote on the rights of non-whites or of same-sex people? It just seems wrong. And so I think she really set a precedent.
And there seems to me that there's sort of almost two separate issues. One is that there's the right to go to restaurants and so on and so forth, but there's this inequality that is underneath, both in terms of economics. We mentioned a moment ago about the unemployment rate, but the housing itself was substandard. The people did not necessarily have indoor plumbing. I mean, this was not a particularly great situation for African Americans at the time in that town.
Yeah, and it's not Cambridge. I mean, this is all across America. I mean, these were issues that were coming and percolating up in Cambridge in 63, 64, kind of before the urban rebellions of the larger cities in the north, which everyone would recognize was over issues like housing and jobs. So in some ways, Cambridge was a bellwether for what was to come elsewhere. And interesting, what Richardson did is, with a bunch of students, she conducted a door-to-door survey. She had been a sociologist with people and asked them, what are your needs? Let's not talk down to the community. Let's find out what your needs were. And the needs showed, they didn't mind desegregating public establishments, but, the clear needs were housing, jobs, and they also wanted recreational opportunities. I mentioned that pool before, instead of getting to swim in the pool. And this is true all over America. Blacks were kept out of public pools and forced to swim in unsafe environments or have no recreational opportunities at all. So I think that just kind of fueled an anger in the black community. Why aren't they being treated equally?
When you look back at that period, we live in a much different period, although obviously there's things are going on, and we can talk about it in a moment. But is that a reality? I mean, sometimes it's shocking at the kind of treatment that people certainly underwent, and the kind of poverty that they, and the kind of discrimination that they face, which now we we know that there's discrimination that goes on, but nonetheless, this is like something that's so stark.
I think Gloria Richardson awakened everyone in America's senses. She called attention to the issue. I mean, what Dr. Levy said is so true. She was able to get the executive branch of the United States to come to Cambridge and work to wager an agreement. An African American woman. I mean, that is amazing in itself. She was before her time. I think she's still before her time. Having been a student or a scholar of her work, I'm still inspired. I mean, every day you kind of have to get up and say, how would she do these things? You're not fearful. You go ahead and you tackle it. And she was saying that, racism and poverty is not just a Southern issue. It's a nationwide issue. It's beyond the barriers of Alabama and Mississippi, but in Maryland we're having these same problems. I mean, one of the things that she struggled with Martin Luther King is that he felt, oh, you have the right to vote up there in Maryland. You're kind of playing around. And she's saying, but if I vote and it doesn't count, what does it matter? I mean, that's just, even today, you think about like the last election we had with all this issue of, Russia hacking into our election system. That's still something we face today. Our vote is the most sacred right we have, and she did not take it lightly, but she made them understand that if we vote, we're going to vote for something that we can see, not something that you're going to, imaginary promise. She really believed in what she was doing. I mean, she helped, if you look at what she did, although the Treaty of Cambridge did not succeed in Cambridge at the time, she helped pass a anti-discrimination act across the state. J. Miller Tawes was intimidated by Robert F. Kennedy. He was intimidated by Gloria Richardson, and he had to do something. So when the Eastern Shore was left out of that, initial anti-discrimination bill across the state, she was, pushing Kennedy, pushing Tawes, and eventually the whole act came together for the whole state. She did that. I mean, that's a dynamic woman. They call her the female dynamo in some articles. But she really is a dynamic individual. And I think that what she was doing was way beyond her time. But we can definitely gather a lot from what she did. And we could repeat it because it's so valuable. You have to stand for something. You can't just, go along with everything.
So, Peter, let's go up to, I guess it's this July, it's the 24th, I think it is, when things begin to unfold. So what's going on that day? And I understand that H. Rep. Brown is actually asked to come there. Describe a little bit about him, and what is the situation like at that moment?
Well, I'm going to admit I have somewhat of a revisionist view of what took place. So,
yes, I read
maybe
that.
that's going to be helpful because everyone says H. Rep. Brown came there, gave a speech, and caused a riot. And
right.
So I think we need to put the context for it. First, there had been a white power rally a couple days earlier. And the policemen had gone in and stopped the white power rally, claiming this guy was, I think his name was Carroll, was going to cause a riot. But in fact, they just brought him in protective custody and did nothing. They just let him go a couple hours later. So Brown comes in on the evening of the 24th. He's a little late. There's a crowd of probably 250 to 300 on the streets. He delivers clearly a fiery address, but, fiery addresses have been delivered in Cambridge and other places times before. So, for example, earlier on, Dick Gregory had come to the community and delivered somewhat of a militant address, and that was it. So he ends the address around 10 o'clock, proceeds to walk a young black woman to her home. Before he can even get there, a deputy sheriff fires into the air, ricochets, hits H. Rep. Brown, and wounds him. He gets band-aided up and secreted out of town. There's still kind of a kind of urban legend that he got put in a casket and secreted out of town. We don't know. It's very possible because usual funeral homes were kind of in the heart of the black community. But then things calmed down. And by midnight, the National Guard commander, a guy named General Gelston, who had been here on and off since the early 60s, told the National Guard they could go home. The state troopers decided this thing was basically safe enough and went home. And then a little later, a fire broke out at the Pine Street Elementary School, which was this old, decrepit school that Brown had pointed to and singled out. But rather than put out the fire department just sat on the sidelines for almost an hour, hour and a half. And by the time the fire engines finally went in, much of the Second Ward blocks of the Second Ward had burned down, including one of the most prominent business establishments, a church. Spiro Agnew, who was this unknown kind of governor at the time, later became vice president, rushed to Cambridge from his summer home in Ocean City and immediately declared H. Rap Brown had incited this riot, demanded his arrest. He was arrested and really for the next 4 or 5 years went through one of the kind of craziest sequences of being arrested, let out, bailed out. Ultimately, the state of Maryland actually dropped the inciting riot charges against him in 1922. But he became like boogeyman number one. He was, was on the FBI most wanted list. And Agnew, in contrast, became famous. The only Maryland, I think he's the only Maryland ever to become vice president. I may be incorrect about that.
That could be. I want to bring Lawrence McMillan in here. So you're in law enforcement. What do you make of these events as they unfold? I mean, in terms of the relations, obviously between the community and the authorities there. What's your sense about that?
It's always been a strong belief of mine that it's almost like it's human nature to do what you can get away with. It's been my experience professionally and personally, and it's kind of the American way. So even in a town like Cambridge, which was fairly well integrated, and it was a place where African Americans could be, and for a while they had good jobs and so forth. But the economic struggles that took place, it was still not quite as bad as other places to live. It wasn't like clear-cut Jim Crow or anything like that. But there's always going to be a factor of we're going to do what we can get away with until a Gloria Richardson steps up and shines light on what the circumstances are and demands a certain level of change. The police in the situation where they tracked Brown, for a sheriff's deputy to feel like this is the right thing to do for me to go, fire a shot in the air, and now this guy gets shot and so forth. These people, every step of the way, there were people who were only going to do what they could get away with as long as nobody else shined too much light on it. It's one of the reasons why I got involved in law enforcement myself, is because I felt like in order for the folks in the neighborhood that I live in the places that I grew up, to get the kind of service and protection that they needed from the police, there needed to be more people from that place doing that job. And in every aspect of life, when you actually take an active part in the organizations and societal procedures that you feel like you and your community are being disserviced in, those same areas are going to continue to function in a way that falls short of what it is you feel like you need, and that's what happened. That's what happened. So until people actually step forward and take over roles in organizations, police and military and politics, until we move into those areas and start to actually affect changes, things don't change. And it's the American way. You don't get your civil rights. You don't get your rights to vote. You don't get same-sex marriage until people move into those realms where those decisions are made and actually affect the change themselves.
Peter, I want to turn to H. Rap Brown for just a moment because, as you say, there's been this connection, whether it's erroneous or not. He is quoted, and tell me if this is true, he's quoted as saying that if this town don't come around, then this town should be burned down. And he suggested that honkies, quote unquote, they shoot them to death, I think was the phrase. And I understand that Richardson had cautioned him not to be too fiery. What are we to make of this? Is that true?
She knows what she's got. They had asked to bring in a militant leader, so it was either H. Rap Brown or Stokely Carmichael, and that's who was available. Brown was really relatively unknown at the time. It's kind of ironic that when he became the leader of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, there was some hope that he would maybe return the organization to what might be called kind of its grassroots organizing kind of mission, which is really what it had been in the early 1960s. But he didn't get the name rap by chance. He didn't have rap music yet, but he was known as a talker. But he was an organizer too, and I think you need to think of his words as rhetorical. He's trying to raise black consciousness. That's what's going on in the mid 1960s, 1960s. With black power. If you listen to Muhammad Ali, you could say, oh God, he's picking a fight. No, he was raising black consciousness about, what was allowable. Is exactly what Lawrence is saying. What was allowable and not allowable for black athletes to say. People were unaccustomed to black athletes or even a lot of black activists to speaking in a language that excited people beyond those who were in the church. I mean, there's something to that. I mean, Gloria Richardson had talked about wanting to reach out to what she called the churched and unchurched, and H. Rap Brown could do that. He was also an organizer. I mean, he had spent time in the Black Belt in Alabama. I think what happens is the media was looking for boogeymen at the time. If you look at the media's representation of black power, it's just terrible. I mean, the media has a reputation for being a friend of the civil rights movement.
Not changed at all.
If you look at their view of Black Lives Matter, I mean, it's pretty much the same thing. The only time they follow or look in some ways at Baltimore is when it explodes. What has been the coverage of Baltimore in the 20 years beforehand, except for violence or an explosion? So I don't think it's changed that much.
Let me ask you this.
And
Go ahead.
Brown's actually an example of that. When you find a leader who feels like they need to be that abrasive, that's almost a one-man riot. That's somebody who has seen Martin Luther King and Gloria Richardson try the amicable approach and say, that's not cutting it. So we have to shake things up. Malcolm X, to a degree, and that's what that is. It's a cry for help. It's we've tried it your way. Somebody's got to do it a different way.
Because one of the things that strikes me in terms of the tension actually within the movement itself is that, I mean, this, in 67, of course, already we've had like this, the civil rights legislation's been passed, the Voting Rights Act has been passed, and there is a sense, particularly I've read some of the studies, that there was a sense of expectations, that things were moving forward, and that obviously that wasn't happening on the ground level. I mean, that people's lives still went on, even if you pass this landmark legislation. Is that tension then that pushes, I think, within the movement? Or what do you think? Do you think there's that dynamic to tension that to say, we know that, and there's always that classic debate, I think, with, between Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr., right? And what's the right approach and so on. I mean,
I think that when he says explode, that's where they were. They were at that peak. They were waiting. They had been patient. They had marched. They had protested. They had, taken the heat. And at that point, I think the African Americans in this country they were ready for a change. And I think H. Rap Brown, in that militant speech, I guess, he offered that ability. He said what they were feeling, those visceral feelings deep down inside that they couldn't, convey in the early 1960s when, we were holding hands and marching. Those feelings now were at the top and they were ready to just burst. And so I think that's what he did. He said those things. But another thing is he was moving around a lot at that time. He was in Cambridge, for just a few hours, really. And so for the whole image of Cambridge to kind of be left with his image, I think is where it struggles, or whatever, the legacy struggles, because it was the last thing to happen. So you have this riot in 1967, and you have H. Rap Brown come, the FBI is looking for him. He's trying to get on the plane at Reagan International Airport or National Airport and fly away. There's just a lot going on. He's trying to escape, and there are people who are closely watching him, and so they associate that with Cambridge, not realizing that in 1962 and 63 there was a successful movement in Cambridge, that they achieved a lot then and there, and that's not all to it. I mean, there's about 7 or 8 years of this whole process, but that's not all that Cambridge is. And I think that although H. Rap Brown, he didn't intend for what happened to happen, but I think his legacy is left with Cambridge, and so that's where you have an issue with resolving it with historical memory is, we remember the last event, we don't remember the first thing that happened, we don't remember Gloria Richardson in the way that we should, and I think that there's a shift. Definitely. We're having this conversation tonight. There's going to be today. There's a panel tonight. So we're talking about it. We're getting, the facts out there so that people can start thinking about it, start churning to say, there was more to Cambridge than 1967. There was more to Cambridge than July 24th. They are still a thriving people. Their history goes back until the early settlements of this country. So we have to reevaluate how we encapsulate their narrative. H.R. Brown, he definitely brought national attention to it, but there's way more to Cambridge than just that one day.
Peter,
How many times?
Go ahead.
How many times have we dealt with that since? You can't go a quarter century in this country without African Americans being reminded of just who they are and where they stand. The Rodney King verdict, the George Zimmerman verdict. It's like every 20, 25 years they show,
Every couple of weeks nowadays.
So every so often there's like a reset button. Like, all right, you guys have been doing good, but okay,
Let me ask you, I'm going to repeat some words back to Peter here. I ran across a quote which you said that Cambridge gave politicians a chance to frame all unrest as a result of agitation by black radicals, not the legitimate end of product of generations of inequality. I mean, is that what happened?
Yeah, so I think focusing on Brown is
right.
just a diversion. So it's kind of interesting that, so here we are this week, it's the 50th anniversary of the Kerner Commission report.
Right.
And the Kerner Commission report, gives what, is relatively somewhat, to me, middle-of-the-road statement. It said basically whites are responsible for creating these ghettos, and it was the ghettos that creates the riots. And what happens? Johnson creates the commission, ignores it. Humphrey as vice president ignores it. And instead we have this vacuum created. Okay, the liberals aren't going to seize hold of it. And they turn to radicals like Brown and said, you guys are causing the trouble. Agnew's argument was that the commission blamed everyone but those who rioted themselves. And it was just a diversion. It was just a diversion tactic. In fact, Agnew went further and then blamed essentially liberals and black moderates for what they considered to be this kind of permissive cultural society. I mean, this just happened down in Florida, where a gunman comes in and shoots a bunch of students, and I get on TV yesterday and there's a guy blaming rap music. I'm a little confused. It's like the ability to divert attention to what really creates the problem is just amazing.
Although,
as Lauren says, it keeps happening over and over again. Ken Clark gave kind of the closing testimony. Ken Clark's the famous psychologist who did the Dahl studies for the Brown decision. He gives a closing testimony in the Kerner Commission report, and he basically says, look, there was a report on 1919 riots in Chicago. There were reports on Harlem in 41. There were reports about Watts, and it's the same findings, but everyone just ignores it. And the Kerner Commission actually thought it was going to be different, but it wasn't any different this time around.
Well, the question I have is that on the one hand you say, well, okay, so you had H.R. Brown and others for that matter, and the whole Black Power movement, right, which then allowed whites to say at the period, well, okay, it's these radicals that are doing it. But if these people weren't pushing the envelope to begin with, I mean, are you going to get progress? I mean, isn't there this problem where if they weren't there, would you be making the progress? And I'm curious about, as opposed to, say, for instance, Black Lives Matter, for example, has taken ahead and is described in these very radical terms, even though what they're talking about seems very reasonable. So it seems as if, to me, that the people who are pushing the envelope have to be there to push it, even though you get this backlash.
They're not pushing the
ahead.
envelope. They're holding people accountable.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they're holding the situation accountable.
Right.
They're saying no more. We're not going to take this any longer. You have to do something. Something has to change. And I think that's why it's such a hard issue to resolve in history, is because someone's at fault. And history, there's always someone there's a good person and a bad person. But when it's your narrative, right when you're in it, it's kind of hard to say, you know what, I got to change my ways. I've got to change how I operate. I got to change how I create this culture. I mean, so I think with Black Lives Matter, Gloria Richardson, CNAC, all these organizations, where they said, hey, we have a list of things. You need to be held accountable for this. We need answers. This is not acceptable. Like, we want more. It's not pushing the envelope. It's an issue of accountability. And I think that that's something that the United States still struggles with, is when you give it back to them and say, here it is. And how do they resolve that within themselves?
My observation would be by holding them accountable, by placing in very stark terms, as Richardson did back in the 1960s, or Black Lives Matter now, is yes, that's lifted. That's pushing away and saying, look, you aren't looking at this. And as a result, of course, then you get certainly a backlash in which is, oh, but then these people are just somebody else. I mean, you know what I'm saying? That truth, as it were, becomes a radical idea.
But I think there's a sense that the backlash is a response to the riots. Martin Luther King went around the country in 66, 67, giving a speech that no one ever talks about. It's called the Other America speech, and in which he argues there's these two Americas. And in that speech and others, he kept saying, no, the backlash created the riots, not the other way around. So if you look at Cambridge, there was this vibrant movement, and then from '64 to '67, you had a community that was in backlash. They bring George Wallace in, where he announces his campaign for the presidency in '64, and 2,000 people fill the arena and cheer him like he's God. They don't even vote for Agnew in '66. He's too moderate. They vote for this guy Mahoney, whose campaign slogan was "Your home is your castle, defend it," which meant that there was no way they were going to support open housing legislation. They voted for a mayor, this guy named Pritchard, who was part of this all-white fire company, who had got clobbered in 1960 by kind of this old Phillips Packing Company moderate, and now he's winning easily. He's winning the four white wards overwhelmingly. They've already said, okay, you guys protested nonviolently, and we're going to backlash against it. So that's why they're bringing Brown in. And I'm going to repeat this. Brown did not cause a riot. There was no looting in Cambridge. We associate riots with looting. None. You know, what there is a fire that gets out of hand that an all-white volunteer fire company refuses to put. I think we need to ask ourselves, why was it in the year 1967 there's an all-white fire company? You know, and would be for the next 20 years there would be an all-white fire company. John Barth, who's this famous novelist who grew up in Cambridge, his father had been in the fire company, lambasted the community for this. He asked, you know, why aren't people asking, why did you, you know, why was this a situation? If this had been a desegregated fire company, they would have intervened.
Firefighter who could just grab a hose.
Yeah.
Those people, instead of going on a rioting, could have helped him put the fire out.
Let me, so finally, as we sort of wrap up here, so we are now more than a little 50 years from Cambridge. Do you think, are there lessons to be learned from it, but how far forward have we come in terms of the kinds of lessons that we should have learned?
You guys shoot.
Oh.
You got it. Jordy, it's yours.
I think that there's a lot to learn from Cambridge. I think that, you know, the stick-to-itiveness that Gloria Richardson possesses and that she still has. I mean, if you've ever met her, she is one of the most amazing people to... Like, she's my Beyonce. I always tell people that if I had a Beyonce, it would be Gloria Richardson. But I think that we have to learn to stand up for something, to be confident as a woman. I mean, Gloria Richardson inspires me in so many different ways. Just, you know, I'm not going to take it. She one time said, I'm a woman, I can't be a statesman, when she was talking to Robert Kennedy. And that, like, always sticks in my mind. Like, if you're going to put me in this box, then I can't do this. But if you want me to come to the table and work with you, you're going to treat me like an equal person. I'm not going to, you know, play both sides of the fence. I'm going to either come equally or not at all. I mean, she was successful in her conversations with Robert Kennedy, but she said that to him because he had said to her, oh, you're not smiling enough or whatever. And that, you know, patronizing her. And so I think that we need to definitely pay more attention to Cambridge. History is bound to repeat itself if we don't learn from it. I think things are changing, but it may not be in Cambridge this time, but it could be somewhere else. It could be in another city. It could be another part of Maryland. We have to really hold this history near and dear because it was a successful movement. It tried to accomplish its goals. It did a good job. It has a strong foundation, and I think that people can build upon it. I think that in this new age of Black Lives Matter and Me Too, that we're forgetting to look back at the past and see, you know, there's a playbook. There's a whole playbook for us to follow to learn from that. And I think that we have to look at those people who come before us before we move ahead, because if we don't know, we're going to repeat it again.
Well, we were speaking with Artura Jackson. She is a Salisbury University alum, amongst other things. Also, she's in charge of a Black History program for some Maryland counties. Also, we have, of course, Dr. Peter Levy. He is professor of history and political science at York University in Toronto. Also, author of a number of articles and books on the uprising, including Civil War on Race Street, the Civil Rights Movement, and also Lawrence McMillan. He is a Philadelphia detective, and I appreciate you all stopping by and chatting with us this morning.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank
It was
you.
great. Yes.
This has been Delmarva Today. I'm Don Rush. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for watching Delmarva Today, a production of Delmarva Public Radio. Production and audio engineering by Chris Rank. Hosted by Don Rush. For podcasts, visit delmarvapublicradio.net or subscribe to the Delmarva Today podcast on iTunes. Delmarva Today can now be seen on Pack 14.